coming. This was a last-minute kind of haphazard thing. I hope it's not too hot in here. So thank you everyone for coming, but the big thanks, and he's going to let me do this, goes, the reason this is free, the reason this is all happening really is thanks to Steve Pinker. So everybody please give me a huge round of McWhorter, of course, as well, is also working for free tonight, so a huge round of teaching many classes today and already braining
40
your
classes.
brain cells, but we're going to do it a little more. So, I want to lay out a little bit of the what I want to do. I'm going to moderate, but this is certainly not a debate. We might find some difference, but a lot of overlap. I'm going to prod and moderate, but I want you guys also to feel free to ask each other questions. I'm sure we're going to get into some topics that you know way more about than I do. So the first part that we want to talk about is linguistics. We'll probably spend about half an hour on linguistics. This is something you've probably seen on their resumes, and a lot of people, maybe in this audience, read their other books a lot more than their linguistics books. We're going to try to convince you that linguistics is not something to ignore. And then we're going to try to transition into something that might be a little more familiar of progress denialism, which is very much along the lines of Steve's latest book, An Enlightenment Now, and John, of course, in a lot of his work on race. So the first thing I want to do, and you probably get this a lot, is Steve, you can start. What's your quickest pitch for linguistics? What do people think it is, but what is it really, and what's your quickest pitch? Why is linguistics interesting?
Well, linguistics is the study of language. A linguist is not someone who speaks a lot of languages. This is something both John and I probably get. When I tell people I'm a psychologist, first thing they say is, oh, you're probably analyzing everything that I'm saying. And I have to explain, no, a psychologist is not the same as a psychiatrist, and most psychologists are not clinical psychologists. I study the human mind. I'm not analyzing it. You say I'm not a psychoanalyst, I'm not a Freudian. Likewise, if you tell anyone that you're a linguist, the cliched follow-up question is, oh, so how many languages do you speak? And again, that is not what a linguist is in the context of scholarship. Why is linguistics interesting? The simplest answer is that language is a window into human nature. That it is one of the most remarkable things that the human mind does to acquire and use a language. Because so much of our lives is mediated by language. It's how we explain what we know. It's how we share our insights, our knowledge, our emotions. That language is also a particularly informative way to understand what makes us tick.
There's nothing to add to that. I've been using this analogy of, tell me if I'm way off base here, because I'm actually new to actually understanding or thinking I understand a little why linguistics is interesting. I was familiar with all of your other work. I've been thinking about it as I'm speaking words right now. I have really no idea how I'm doing it. It's sudden, it's happening. I'm making sense of them, and you're receiving them. I'm imagining this stream between us of me delivering something and you receiving something. And with this window, maybe that's a better analogy, but I've realized you can kind of ride that stream both ways and discover a lot. What is there to discover in linguistics, then, if that analogy makes any sense?
It does. I mean, for example, it's coming into my right brain, it's going through my amygdala, I'm deciding whether or not you're fearful, then it's going to the left side.
I'm totally terrified.
Nothing will happen. And then I'm hearing it, I'm creating meaning, and then my mouth is moving in response. It's an amazingly intricate process. And what it's all about also is that language is much more complex than we think. It's not just a matter of stringing nouns and verbs and adverbs together. All languages are much more complex than they need to be. That's something that it can be very difficult to understand, that what is in Russian or what is in English, such as distinguishing between he and she, that's not necessary to language. It's a frill. That's what languages are like. And it means that all languages, all dialects, all speech of anybody who isn't cognitively damaged is an amazingly complex thing that no scientific perspective could decree as mistaken or broken. And so whatever kind of linguist you happen to be, and there's a myth out there that I'm what's called a sociolinguist and that what I study is language and society. I play that on TV, it's what the media needs. That is not what I think about when I wake up. But that is a very important message for the world to know about language, and that's part of what linguistics is.
Yeah.
I'll add that. I mean, something that a delicious irony is that neither John nor I is what you would call politically correct. I think we have both earned...
Never heard that. Right.
We've earned a certain number of enemies for various reasons over the years. One thing that we have both explained in our writings independently, just because it's a fact, and that is that certain stigmatized forms of English, such as African American English vernacular, as linguists call it, have extraordinary complexity. They are not degraded or degenerate or incorrect forms of standard English. Honest, when you look at them and you try to figure out how they work, there is a lot of complexity and beauty there. And you can be assured that neither of us is saying that because out of a desire to be politically correct.
Exactly. And I actually did a book a little while ago about Black English, which is not the main thing that I study academically, but I thought the message needs to get out there that it's complex, despite that one hears it as some sort of loose bag of floutings of the real rules. Actually, if a Martian came down and they happened to be in a neighborhood where people were only speaking Black English or African American vernacular English, Steve, I never liked that term. I mean, we both have to use it.
It's better than Ebonics.
I mean, well, Ebonics sounds like a disease, but African American vernacular English is just so long, and then it's abbreviated into something called AV, which sounds like an accident. Black English, basically, is something where the Martian would have as much trouble learning what the rules of that were as they would have had learning what the rules of William F. Buckley's language was. So, yes, that is definitely true.
Yeah. So I want to go to, I think, some of the mistakes that you see other linguists make, or this temptation to, this is something that you wrote a lot about in the language hoax, this temptation to say that you can understand a culture based on the language it uses. I think you wrote about a Hopi language. Yes, that's the grumble. And I loved an example, if you don't mind walking through it, about a language that, and I forget the particular one, I think it was in Australia, that didn't have behind or in front of, but only used north-south.
Are we really going to talk about that?
Would you like
that's fun, yeah. Yeah.
I mean, convince them it's interesting, and then talk.
Oh, you're going to know.
Yes.
All right. So, there is a...
Before you do it, it's because I think where I'm interested in where you're getting to, and where I think they'd really be interested in, is this temptation that people seem to have to say really romantic things about these findings that you both seem quite impressively resistant to say.
Steve, I know you're going to bounce, right? This is this Levinson thing. Okay, so basically there is an idea that many people are very fond of, that the language that you speak is a pair of glasses that channels your thoughts, so that each one of the 7,000 languages is its own kind of acid trip. And you'll read that all the time. It's in the media. The idea is that if somebody speaks something, that channels how they see the world. One of the examples that's interesting that's been given of that is that there's a language called Gugu-Yinitir, and it's spoken in Australia, fascinating language for many reasons, one of which is that you cannot say in front of or behind. For these people, you're always saying that something is north of you or south of you. And so I don't know where we are right now, but let's pretend that this is north. And so I wouldn't say that this is in front of me. I'd say it's north of me, and if I turned around and I was facing the back of this beautiful set, and it's like for the cocktail hour by Gurney or something like that, if I'm back there, then I would still say that over there is north of me. I wouldn't say behind. You can't say that in that language. That is absolutely cool. But there's some people, brilliant people, to be sure, who would tell you that what that means is that the language is channeling how you process the world. There's no front and there's no behind, and that therefore, in this language, because it's north, south, west, east, that channels your view of the world, when really what it is that it's the culture and the topography that are channeling your view and feeding into the language, because, frankly, languages that do this, and there are some, are only spoken where everything's kind of flat. So there's a reason that you don't talk about in front and behind. There are no trees. And so you have to talk about the north and the south. As soon as you bring these people into a city, they stop doing that. And so it's interesting because it's how topography can influence a language, but not how the language channels your thought. And I learned this sort of thing, and I'm not just making this up for some kind kind of euphony. I first learned this because you get this perspective in undergraduate school. I remember getting it from this kind of narcoticized guy talking about Hopi and thinking, that's just cool. From Steve, your work, I learned that stuff is not true from you. So,
I'm glad that John brought up that example because it shows one of the recurring, just logical flaws in a lot of the examples, both in everyday conversation and in the academic literature, in the claim that the language that you speak determines the way you think. Because the comparison always is between our culture and some other culture. And we speak English or other European languages which are related to each other, and they speak some other language. But the inference is always, if there are differences in the way people behave, think, remember, perceive, that shows that it must be caused by the differences in the language. But what people often don't reason through is, well, you've got a confound. You've got a particular culture, you've got an ecosystem, you've got a language, and then you've got some cognitive difference. Why are you so sure that it's the language that causes the cognitive difference, as opposed to the often massive differences in the ecology and lifestyle, including such as whether you live in an environment in which there are salient cardinal directions of north, south, east, and west? You can also find these languages in areas that are, say, dominated by a mountain ridge or a valley, where every time you go outside, you've got this coordinate system that's just hitting you in the face. Conversely, you don't get languages that make a big deal out of left and right the way ours do in languages that tend not to be literate, where you have to constantly pay attention to the difference between left and right, because that's the way you read. In fact, cognitively,
I never thought about that. Yeah.
We, like virtually all animals, easily confuse left and right. There's a deep ecological reason for that, namely gravity makes up different from down. You don't need language, you don't need culture, that's just physics in the environment that we live in. Any organism that moves, front is different from back, but there's nothing really that differentiates left and right except for human artifacts like letters of the alphabet and automobiles and so on. So left mirror image reversals or confusions are really the rule rather than the exception, just because of our environment. So for example, if I took a photograph of any scene in the world and I turned it upside down, you'd look at it and you say, oh, it's upside down. If I flipped it left to mirror reversed it, unless it had writing in it, you probably wouldn't be able to tell. The world looks the same when it's mirror reversed. That's reflected in our brains. We tend to easily confuse left and right. We never confuse up and down. And most languages don't distinguish consistently left and right, so it's not terribly surprising that non-literate cultures don't have a in front of, behind, left and right distinction that's as salient to them as it is to us. Even then, as Lila Guyton points out, there is a particular island that she's familiar with, in which people really do reckon distance in terms of compass directions. The directions are uptown, downtown, and crosstown, and the island is Manhattan.
I'm going to try again, because I'm still actually just like new to this particular conversation, to give you another analogy and tell me if I have it wrong, or another picture. So is it fair to say that linguistics is a subset of evolutionary psychology? Meaning, so I'm from eastern Pennsylvania, and I've always found it odd that there's no efficient word for plural you in quote-unquote standard English. So in eastern Pennsylvania, where I grew up in Allentown, Pennsylvania, if you know it, you got it, yous. So the waitress would come and say, are yous ready to order? My mom's from Pittsburgh, it was yins there. So is it just that there is a need? That one feels like an obvious need to me, and a total oversight from whoever. And so is there a need, and then it gets filled? Like you're in a grocery store and you find a product and people are buying it. Is that like a sound that became a word because there was some sort of free market demand for it that we needed a word for you, so we came up with yous and y'all?
I see where you're coming from. And yes, languages are like cats. You know how
I
cats...
like your analogy way better.
I mean, you're absolutely right, but there's a caveat. Cats, you know, they're always crawling into things. You know, they always have to get under the shoe, they have to get in. That's what a grammar does. And so if there's some little fillip of distinction in terms of semantics, languages have a way of choosing which ones they're going to crawl into. A language often wants there to be a singular and a plural you. And so in English, for reasons nobody completely understands, plural you ousts thou. That happens a very long time ago, and we're getting along pretty well with singular and plural you. A language probably doesn't want to stay that way, and so then you get y'all and yous and yins, which are made fun of because we live in Western societies with certain prescriptive views, and so we're told that it's wrong for no scientific reason. But there are languages where really you don't have a difference between singular and plural pronouns, or you only have it with, for example, I and we. But there are languages where it's you, and the same word for he, she, it, and they. This takes us actually back to not Australia, but New Guinea. So a language may just let it be, but there's still a tendency. Yes, languages wish to be like the cat and fill in the squares, and that's what yins is.
Yeah.
Well, it's been argued that in at least standard conversational English, the growing second person plural is not y'all or yous, but you guys. And if you listen to the way you guys is used, it's not exactly a second person plural, but it's moving in that direction. I think this actually underscores a general property of language. It's one that John alluded to, and he's written about it, and Ivan. Which is that one reason that language isn't exactly a subfield of evolutionary biology, or as we'll talk about tomorrow is Noam Chomsky Day.
Happy birthday, Noam.
Noam Chomsky's 90th birthday. According, was the film Captain Fantastic?
Yeah.
In which the family celebrates Noam Chomsky Day instead of Christmas, is it?
Yeah.
Chomsky has once said, this affected me a lot as a student. He said that linguistics is a subfield of cognitive psychology. Now I think that's not exactly true.
He said that?
He said that
Okay.
back in the 70s.
Okay.
The reason that so you might think that language reflects human need to communicate, and when there's a need it gets filled, and that is roughly true over long periods of time. But the reason that it isn't perfectly true is that it's not enough that there be a way of expressing a thought for it to become entrenched in the language. It has to be common knowledge in the sense that the entire community has to tacitly agree that that's the way you express the thought. If you're the only one that uses a word or a construction, you may as well not use it at all, because no one will know what you're talking about. There's a process that I think we don't understand, where certain innovations, as we say, go viral, they become memes, they eventually become entrenched in the linguistic community, the language then changes. But there's a lot that is unpredictable, chaotic, contingent about that process, and the mere fact that we need something is no guarantee that it will A, materialize, and B, go viral enough that it becomes a part of the language. And there are there are long lists of things that would be really handy if we had a way to express, but we just don't, for whatever reason. It just never, either no one was clever enough to innovate the form, or if they did, it was interred with their bones and it never went viral.
Yeah. The chance element, that's one of the hardest things to really wrap your head around in how language changes, and in any science. There's always an extent to which you're dealing with what you could use a $10 word for, stochastic. There's an extent to which it's just probabilistic. And you don't want that because it's not an explanation, but often if you're a linguist who tries to communicate with the public and you get a lot of questions, like I'm doing a podcast now and I get lots of questions, about one question out of 3, the answer is there's no explanation for that, it's just chance. And I always feel so bad in having to tell someone that. And of course, you have to be careful, because sometimes you might say that when really it's just that you're too lazy to understand the explanation. But really, a lot of the time, it's just chance that has to be built into a model of how languages work, which brings us back to this language and thought idea, where people often think what's in the language reflects something about the people, when more often, say with crazy gender in European languages, where the moon is a girl and boats aren't. And from English, we just have to learn that things are in these genders. That's not cultural. That's just an accident that gets dragged along like the cans behind a car when somebody just got married in the Deer Hunter or something like that. That's just the way the language is, because babies and toddlers can acquire almost anything. And by the time they realize what a mess they've acquired, it's too late, because they're going to college and they can't change the way they talk. That's a lot of how language works.
Yeah. There is, I mean, it's funny that this isn't more widely publicized, that so much of variation in language, the fact that some languages have subject-verb-object order, some have subject-object-verb, some have enormous numbers of suffixes, some it's just word, and you don't do much to the word. A long list of these differences, but amazingly, it's very hard, almost impossible to correlate them with anything about the cultures. They really are kind of frozen historical accidents coming about, I think, from the requirement that language, at the same time as it's communicative, it also has to be conventionalized. Those are two different design requirements on a language, often in tension, with the result that even though languages are amazingly useful, they are also what happen to get entrenched in a community. There's a lot of VHS versus Betamax and the QWERTY keyboard and Microsoft software, things that it just, by the time it was widely adopted, it was too late to redesign it.
So I want to ask when you were most tempted to make these big leaping claims. Did either of you in your research, I mean, the temptation when you're in a lab for 30 years doing studies to run out and say you found God and the theory of everything is really high, instead of saying I found nothing, isn't this great? When did you find something you were most tempted? I love, and if you bring it to, I love the book The Language Hoax, and you talk about.
Thank you.
This. It's a really, if you want to get in, I honestly think it's a great intro.
There should be a movie of it.
I don't know anyone who does that. You talk about this probably a random wrinkle of languages that some say a long time versus some say a lot of time, and how that showed up. Because I'm interested in, is there never a feedback loop? There's some people, mostly psychologists, who find a word in a language and then, I forget her name now, I was watching a TED Talk.
Lara Boroditsky.
She might be one. I was reading one who...
There's another one?
It might be the same one. She was talking about a language where they had a certain word for homesickness and nostalgia where people would die from it. Because they had a specific word from it, and it was basically, the thesis was, if you have a word for a certain emotion, it allows you to access that emotion
You're gonna drop
deeper level. I'll send you a link.
Please.
but so I hear your skepticism and I appreciate it. So my question is, when have you ever been the most tempted? And if you feel like smuggling in that long time, lot of time thing, I think it's interesting. Both of you, when have you been the most tempted to make a statement like that?
Well, one professional difference between John and me is that I came to language from cognitive science, cognitive psychology. John actually is a bona fide linguist. I might just pretend to be one. And I immediately thought that the radical version of the linguistic determinism hypothesis, sometimes called the Whorf-Sapir hypothesis after the two linguists who made it famous. The reason I thought this just could not, in its strong form, didn't make sense is that the mind just could not work with a particular language as its internal medium of communication. That is, if the operating system of the mind just can't be English for a number of reasons. One of them is, just think about your knowledge of the world. I hope that when you come out of this evening, you'll have learned a couple of things. If I were to challenge you to come up with a single verbatim sentence that any of the three of us had uttered, there'd be no way that you would remember the exact wording, but you remember the gist. And a powerful phenomenon of human memory is that memory for gist, for content, for meaning, far exceeds memory for form. That's one thing that says that the language of thought, so to speak, can't be English or French or Saramaccan or Japanese and so on. Second is, and this is how I came to it, I was interested in how children acquire their first language to begin with. You're born into the world, you have no idea whether your community is going to be speaking Japanese or English or Yiddish or Saramaccan. You've got to figure out how the language works as a child. And we have reason to believe this is not just pure cryptography. It's not kids just listening to a long stream of sounds and counting up how often one sound comes out after another, looking for patterns the way code breakers break code. One of the reasons we know that is that kids can't learn a language from the language itself. If, say, a deaf couple has a hearing child and they plunk him in front of the TV, hoping that he'll learn English that way, he doesn't learn English. Kids don't learn English from TV because they're not involved in that world. And we have reason to believe that the way kids crack the code of language is that they match what they hear with their own understanding of the situation from all of the rest of the mind. Their understanding of the physical world, their understanding of what other people are likely to be saying. And the language acquisition consists of matching the signal, the blah, 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 with the cognitive appraisal of the world, what mom and dad are probably trying to say in context. So without some ability to represent the world, before you even have a language, you wouldn't be able to learn a language in the first place. So language can't be the medium of thought. If it were, then babies would be incapable of thought, which would mean they'd be incapable of acquiring a language. And then finally, if you just look at the distinctions that words carry, they are way too coarse to actually represent the way we think intelligently. I mean, an example from computer scientist Drew McDermott is when you hear simple sentences like, Ralph is an elephant, Ralph has tusks, Ralph lives in Africa. You understand that perfectly well. But you also know that Ralph's tusks belong to Ralph alone. They're not the same tusks that other elephants have. But the Africa that Ralph lives in is the same Africa that the other elephants live in. This and hundreds of other logical distinctions are not actually carried in words, but they're part of the effortless understanding of the meaning behind sentences. One of the reasons that computers still can't understand very well is that we haven't duplicated all of the subtle conceptual semantic distinctions that the mind is capable of and implemented them in software. Language is really a tip of the iceberg of the distinctions that we make conceptually.
Jay, I think what you want with the long night is important to counterbalance what Steve just said, in that despite that language could not possibly be the channeler of thought that we think. Once there is language, there are certain effects that can happen. And psychologists have shown this, and it's important in evaluating Morphianism to acknowledge those experiments. And so, for example, this is one of my favorites. It's by Daniel Casasanto, who is a psychologist. He's now at Cornell. He has shown that in English we talk about having had a long night. In Greek, you would say that you had a large night. Now, in itself, that is probably the least interesting observation you have ever heard. But in English, we say a long night. In Greek, you say a large. You say a large night. Now, it turns out that actually, let me change it. In English, we say a long time, and then in Greek, you would say a lot of time. It turns out that if you show a line moving from left to right, and you ask somebody to time when the line is going to hit the right, and then you show a cube filling up as if it was filling up with water, and you ask them to time when it's going to fill up. If somebody speaks English, then they're better at predicting when that line is going to hit than when this volume is going to fill up, because we talk about a long time instead of a lot of time. Greek talks about a lot of time, and so this line, they're better at predicting when the cube is going to fill up. Now, that's not cultural. It must have something to do with the fact that in one language you say a long time, in another language you say a lot of time. Nobody would think of it, but that's the way it works, and it works when you throw other languages into the hopper. It's a highly predictable effect. So that shows that your language can influence thought, but is that a worldview? What kind of worldview is it that you can predict when on a screen, when you're tied into some booth as an undergraduate doing a very artificial experiment for money, that you can figure out when this thing is going to hit the edge? And so these things are clear. They are there. Lara Boroditsky is very good at creating these experiments. She's at UC San Diego, I think, right now, and she has a TED Talk. She's very good at it. Those things are real, but the question is whether those things create a worldview. And what got up my nose about this whole Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, which is not what I originally was studying. It started to bother me because I study Creole languages, which are brand new languages that formed from what was not language. Pidgin languages are what happens when, for example, slaves are brought into a community, have to learn a language very quickly. They're adults. Adults don't learn language as well. You come up with about 500 words and you're just kind of shifting them around to communicate. No human being can live with that for the rest of their lives, and so from the pidgin you build up a Creole. But if the language is that new, and it's built up from something so elementary relatively recently, it's not going to be as busy as Russian. It's not going to be like Japanese. It's not going to have tones like Chinese. And so these are languages that are relatively telegraphic. And it occurred to me as I studied these languages that based on this Whorfian idea that if your language is jangling with all of these things that are clearly due to chance, but they're channeling your thought, then it means that somebody in Jamaica or somebody in Haiti must not be having as many thoughts. And I thought, that doesn't make sense to me. And so I started looking at Whorfian views and what they imply, not to defend Creoles, because it occurred to me that it was just linguistically incoherent. So that's why it ended up jumping upon me. It wasn't originally my obsession.
Yeah. So we're going to try to do the dance a little bit towards the second topic here. Steve, I think you were approaching a bit of your blank slate thesis in your last answer. So we're going to try to do this dance. We were doing this over email a little bit to talk about progress denialism. Did Chomsky make errors that you maybe expose a bit in the blank slate, or am I getting that wrong, that then may have possibly led to some of his political stances, which would relate to the second part of our conversation a bit, if that makes sense?
Well, I don't want to label them as errors, but there are Chomsky. Now might be a good time just to mention some of his. Why some people observe Noam Chomsky Day, why he has become such a guru, a hero, a messiah, I think to an unhealthy degree, but there's just no question that he's a major figure in the history of thought, really. I mean, among other things, the very insight that John mentioned at the beginning, namely that when you know language, you don't have, what you know is not just an inventory of words or constructions, but there is a combinatorial ability to generate an infinite number of sentences when you speak, to understand an infinite number of sentences when you comprehend, and that what makes language so interesting is that it isn't just a list of constructions from the phrase book. There's got to be some cognitive algorithm that we apply pretty much effortlessly as we speak and understand, the details of which have to be acquired in childhood in a rather remarkable feat of induction. That is, the grammar of English, or for that matter, Creole languages, has a lot of computational complexity, which is never laid out as a set of instructions, but is inferred from examples in context. So that's what makes language such an amazing human feat, and it was Noam Chomsky who first pinpointed that fact as the central puzzle for linguistics, and led to his suggestion that linguistics was a subset of a subfield of cognitive science. Chomsky also, in suggesting that, claiming that feat that children accomplish could not be accomplished without a considerable amount of innate structure. At various times he called it universal grammar, or the language acquisition device, the hypothetical circuitry that makes language acquisition possible. He made the whole idea of innateness, of the nature side of the nature-nurture debate, intellectually respectable for the first time in centuries. This was almost considered beyond the pale in mainstream Anglo-American linguistics, and psychology and philosophy, and as a young man, he forced everyone to take it seriously again. Those were
within a very small amount of time.
Within a very small amount of time. In 1957, he published the book called Syntactic Structures, almost unreadable, but a real classic.
They should make a movie of it.
then wrote a review of the book by B.F. Skinner, the famous Harvard behaviorist psychologist, the one who spent his career studying rats and pigeons, formed a general theory of learning based on increases and decreases in the rate of behavior as a function of reward and punishment. When Skinner tried to extend those ideas to language, Chomsky wrote what has since become a famous review, deconstructing the whole behaviorist enterprise piece by piece, that some people credit with the beginning of the end for behaviorism as a dominant paradigm in psychology. Behaviorism included not just the theory of operant conditioning, of Pavlovian conditioning, but also a kind of philosophy of psychology that said that mental entities like beliefs, desires, rules, memories, emotions were unobservable, hence they were occult qualities like the ether, like phlogiston, should be banned from psychology. So psychology under Skinner's view was not the science of mind, but the science of behavior. And again, among Chomsky's contributions were to pull the rug out from under that and make talk of mental entities respectable again.
He left Skinner in that piece a smoking ruin. If any of you want lessons in rhetorically how to destroy anything that you don't like, I recommend taking a read of this, even if you don't have a dog in the fight. Anyway, go ahead.
Yes, and it must be added that he did it not with rants or shaming or name calling. It was a minute analytic dissection, which is what made it partly what made it so effective. Now, many of you are probably also familiar with Chomsky's political writings, and it is quite remarkable that he's been so prolific in both fields. And a question that often arises, that of course Chomsky himself had to deal with, is there any connection? And he said mostly not, that these are just two things that he pursued, although in a couple of his writings in the 60s, he did suggest that there is at least some hint, some harmony, some resonance. It may not be a total coincidence, but he would deny that one logically entails the other. And he said that if there is anything in common, it would be a view of human nature, really, that humans have that he associated with the 17th century rationalists. Again, this was highly heretical in the 50s and 60s, in which in philosophy departments, you just were brought up to hate the rationalists. You were taught that they just made an error that was overcome a couple of hundred years ago, and quite heretically, Chomsky tried to revive Descartes and Leibniz, who had kind of become marginalized. Anyway, going back to the common filament, is that if you have a view of humans as internally motivated to create, to express themselves, without the need for external reward and reinforcement. On the one hand, you have a theory of language that says that children don't have to be rewarded with little cookies or bits of praise in order to learn to speak. They just can't help it. It springs from their nature. You also have a theory of economics and politics that says that people don't need external rewards and punishments in the form of salaries and profits, and for that matter, perhaps laws and punishments. And you could be something of a kind of a romantic socialist anarchist, that people are inherently motivated to produce. This was also associated with the young Marx, that people don't need to be paid. The carpenter will want to build things, and the farmer will want to grow things to express their inner generativity. People are naturally cooperative and sociable. They don't need the Leviathan, the external punishments, the incarceration, and so on, in order to harmonize, to live together. And that this view of human nature as inherently generative, creative, is at least a common theme. Although, and to his credit, he wouldn't say that one logically implies the other, but he, in this rare an autobiographical reflection, he, I think, would concede that it isn't a coincidence that he subscribes to both. Would you?
Yeah, that's interesting. He doesn't talk about it much these days, it seems to me. And I think that what fascinates me is that this basic idea that there is an innate specification for language, which I think very few linguists would disagree with, and I think most linguists would agree that there are specifications for language as apart from cognition as itself. That what has developed since syntactic structures is something that's rather hermetic and ingrown, to the point that, as fascinated as I've always been by Chomskyan generative syntax from a distance, for various reasons, I think that if many reasonable people could examine what this universal grammar is posited to be in the literature promulgated by the people who are professionally devoted to it, you would see something that, and I feel funny saying this because it's not something that I do. I don't read this literature every day. I read it about every 2 months when our journal, our flagship journal, Language, comes. And I'll think to myself, it's Friday, I'm actually going to pick my way through one of these generative syntax articles because what the hell are these people doing? And the truth is, something that began making sense has just gone step by step by step. One assumption is made, not significantly tested, but it becomes fashionable, and then new theories are based on that, so that now it's almost impossible to peel away all the layers of the onion. I don't think that it has anything to do with what's really real in terms of the configuration of our brains, in terms of evolutionary psychology, in terms of biology, and yet, I imagine I would be one of these people if I were in this subfield. It just keeps going on. And so I think that many people here would be surprised at what the supposed mechanisms are as to how we generate sentences. It's the most Rube Goldberg, mousetrap, counterintuitive, over-jargonized notion you'll ever see. And it's obvious that certainly we do have a specification for language, and it's based on all sorts of things. We need to be able to share attention. Cats don't look one another in the eye waiting to know what they're going to tell each other. Shared attention is important. Labeling is important. What is a rose? Not just some flower, but you see a rose and you have a name for it and you remember it. There is a such thing as syntax. How do you say that the rose smells a certain way or the rose is over there? Then you have to have displacement. Can you discuss a rose when there are no roses around and they're not going to be? All of that is language. But the idea that syntax in particular is these tinker toys. I mean, just go online and take a look. Just type in generative syntax and look at where it's gone over the past 50 years. It strikes me as, and boy am I going to catch it for this when people watch this online, it strikes me as an unintentionally bankrupt enterprise. And there are new theories of syntax and semantics that actually are consonant with evolutionary biology, with natural selection, with anthropology, with psychology, and with common sense that I think make perfect sense and are complex. I'm not against complexity. I'm just against people playing with their toys and forgetting that there's an outside world. So, Chomsky probably has an IQ of 412, but I think that he and his gang have let something get away from them. And Steve, I think you'd agree that Chomsky is notably unconcerned with teaching us how these tinker toys could possibly have evolved. We assume that things evolve. He doesn't care about that.
That's an understatement.
Right.
Chomsky is, I mean, he is actively hostile to the idea that language is an evolutionary adaptation.
I don't understand that.
So I think it's partly, again, this is part of my own hypothesis as to why the set of ideas should cluster. But Darwin's theory of natural selection kind of looks a lot like Skinner's theory of reinforcement learning. Namely, there is random variation. The environment favors some of the random outputs over others, and then they increase in frequency over time. And the idea that we got the way we are because it was useful, because of external incentives, I think, sounds too much like Skinner, sounds too much like Adam Smith for Chomsky's intuitions. So I think that now this might be unfair. This is not literally what Chomsky would say. I think it's behind this funny intuition. Why would someone who studies something that's so patently useful as language deny that it evolved as a means of communication.
Right. Especially when you're as brilliant as he is.
Well,
yes.
in fact, the brilliance, I agree with everything John said, both with the brilliance, with the somewhat unfortunate influence of the particular mechanisms of mainstream Chomskyan syntactic theory, something that I was very familiar with because I spent 21 years at MIT in a neighboring department to Chomsky's. However, I myself was trained in linguistics from one of Chomsky's renegade students, Joan Bresman. She was my postdoc advisor. She had her own theory of syntax, which is one of a number of families of theories that are, her theory she called lexical functional grammar. There's also construction grammar, generalized phrase structure grammar, which all are, while trying to capture the undeniable complexity of language, have less, what John and I would agree is kind of Baroque, Rococo, New Goldberg.
Needlessly, yeah.
We both agree needlessly, and it's what happens when one person is too influential, no matter how brilliant. If you just cannot make intellectual progress when you have a guru. Science doesn't work with gurus.
Yes, syntax has a pope, I've often heard it said. The people who study sound, phonology, say phonology is closer to truth because we don't have a pope. Whereas I don't think Chomsky wanted to be appointed pope, but he's pope, and so yes. But there are syntactic theories that I think make perfect sense. Frankly, LFG, lexical functional grammar, is one of those. You know, Joan makes sense. But nevertheless, there's this sense that Chomsky's version is the vanguard. It's kind of like serialism in classical music back in the 40s and 50s. Nobody wanted to hear any of that music. And yet the idea was that that was somehow advanced and the people who did it could claim that they were ahead of the curve. There was a fashion. There were probably like 20 of those people, but that was where it was. That, to me, always feels like what particularly Chomskyan syntax is within our field. I've always regretted it.
So, to try to tie this where we're headed, John, you've been using this religious analogy towards well, I guess it's been called social justice warrior kind of ideology on the left.
Yeah.
To try to tie these together, we've been talking about it a little bit. It seemed to me you were saying there's this protected almost soul where evolution doesn't touch it somewhere, where you stop at some point, because once you go to that point, you start infringing on a lot of Abrahamic religious philosophy. Does this also fold in that once you also put sort of evolution on at the psychological level, that you start from not as a blank slate? Does that also fold into your ideology? Is that some resistance that needs to be broken through to pull the rug out from what's been called the SJW religion, which you feel free to lay out that analogy if you want from the beginning, but probably a lot of people are familiar with it at this point.
Sure, yeah. I think that there are times in the way we analyze things in our modern society where we're tacitly taught that at times we're supposed to suspend empiricism, we're supposed to suspend the rules of logic and just believe. And of course, we're familiar with that with, for example, Abrahamic religion, with Christianity. I think that especially over about the past 10 years, we've been encouraged to think that way about social justice, which is a very important thing. But there's a difference between social justice, as in Michael Harrington and Bayard Rustin and Martin Luther King, and social justice as we're often encouraged to frame it these days, where out of a basic commitment to showing that you are not an ist, like for example a racist. The idea is that you're supposed to show that you're not. There are all sorts of things that you will not think about or that you will deny out of a quest to show what you are, in which what you're mainly interested in is outing as heretics those who are not towing the line. And I think that most people who believe in this anti-racist religion, and of course who wants to be a racist, but when it gets religious, I think most people would be surprised to see themselves painted as the sorts that Galileo had trouble with. We look at the sorts of problems that a Galileo had and we think, well, those primitive people who were bothering him for telling the truth. But really, those people were quite human, and we know it because we have many brilliant, well-intentioned humans now who will will say, for example, I'm just going to grab this and then we can get back to the main topic, about, say, black people and cop murders. It's terrible when somebody is killed by an incompetent cop and maybe a racist cop. That's one person. But if you say, well, that same person was in more danger from being killed by someone of his own color from his own community, can't we pay as much attention to problems of violence within depressed black communities? You're not told that that's a different view. You're often told that you're a heretic. Nobody uses that word. The word would be that you're problematic, which is directly analogous today to being told that you're being blasphemous. It stanches discussion, and therefore it stanches justice. There is certainly that kind of view within linguistics in many circles. And so, for example, the idea many people have when they hate on Chomsky is that he is not addressing the social aspect of language. And this isn't where you were going, and Steve, you can go in a different direction. But many people will say, Chomsky couldn't be right that there's universal grammar because that model doesn't incorporate how people use grammar in social space. What a lot of those people mean is that it doesn't incorporate how people forge their identities against the abuses of power manipulated in an unfair way. Many people think that if it isn't about addressing power differentials, then it isn't. Now, science? That's a rather narrow view of science. The reason that anybody would say that you're not doing real intellectual work if you're not addressing power differentials is out of a religion. That's a religion that says that the only intellectually valid thing is to address power differentials rather than the 1,999 other interesting things that there are in the world. Power differentials need to be addressed, but why that one thing? That's a faith. That's something that's crept into academia. It certainly affects linguistics in various ways. Now, to extend that model into the whole Chomskyan orbit, Steve, you can complement this with another way that these things play their part.
Yeah, and for a couple of years, for a second, I'm going to say something that's embarrassing.
Okay.
When you get home, read John's article, Anti-Racism, Our Flawed New Religion.
I didn't hear that.
I read this article, and suddenly, it came out, what, 5 years ago, maybe?
First time I did that was in 15. And then, frankly, there was a better version of it earlier this year. Yeah.
But I read it, and suddenly so much became clear. It was such an insightful analysis of the moment that we are living through, and I think ahead of its time, because it's gotten even more extreme. Extraordinary article. Yes, and I don't think that, so Chomsky's version of leftism and the kind of woke social justice warfare political correctness version are pretty distinct.
Yes.
There's probably some overlap.
That's not really what he's doing. Yeah.
But he is, to his credit, he is a rationalist. He believes in argument, in evidence. I mean, he has his dirty tricks as an intellectual. He's mastered the kind of the litigator's art of debating tactics to win, sometimes above and beyond the goal of clarifying. But it is not, it's not social justice warfare as we've...
No, that's not what he does. He's too rigorous. Yeah.
So can we get then just your, fully in sort of the progress denialism part of this conversation now, just your quickest belief of why people seem to deny the progress, where Steve, obviously in your books and all of your beautiful charts, seems to lay out a really rosy picture, and people just don't seem to want to swallow it. And then yours specific about race.
Yeah, and there are a lot of facts about race that show that we've made tremendous progress. And as with every other form of progress, to say that we've made progress is not to say that we live in a perfect world. That there's still much more progress that can be made. But if you deny the progress that we have made, the only options are to be utterly fatalistic and cynical and say, well, there's no point in trying to make the world any better because all the efforts in the past have failed, so let's just enjoy ourselves. Or to be recklessly radical, to say, since all of our institutions and efforts are failing, we should just smash the machine, just burn the empire to the ground. We know the dangers in that. One of them is it's a game that the right can play as much as the left, and some of the results from 2016 election show that the right has been effective in that rhetoric. And we also know from history that just raising institutions leads to violence, repression, chaos, the new boss same as the old boss, and so on. But anyway, those are some of the dangers of denying progress. In the case of racism, the progress has been, and race, progress has been fantastic. Not just in terms of the well-being of African Americans, such as the fact that, say, a century ago, life expectancy for African Americans was in the 30s, and it was about 25 years below that for whites. Now it is in the 70s, and it's about 3 years below that for whites. And in fact, if you make it to the age of 65, your expected years of life are greater if you are African American than white. Now that's not necessarily something to celebrate. That's partly because of the opioid crisis and the fact that things have gotten worse for whites. But it does mean that the gap is not only closed, but in that case reversed. 100 years, not 100 years ago, 60 years ago, more than half of African Americans lived below the poverty line. Now it's less than a quarter, so it's doubled. Since 1970, happiness for African Americans has increased. Happiness for whites is pretty much flattened. And so the inequality in happiness has greatly reduced. And if you look at expressions of racism, the percentage of people that would agree to propositions that are undoubtedly racist, such as black and white kids should go to different schools, blacks and whites shouldn't marry, blacks are less intelligent, blacks are less hardworking. The percentage agreeing to that has just plummeted. In some cases to kind of levels of crank opinion, some cases to a still regrettable level of 20%. So racism absolutely exists. But as opposed to the idea that we're all subtle, unconscious, implicit racists, I think the real problem is that some number of us are out-and-out racists. Now that number has declined. It'll probably continue to decline, but it's certainly not zero. And one other fact, I think I can mention this from my colleague Mahzarin Banaji and her student Tessa Charlesworth. Mahzarin is famous for documenting subtle patterns of implicit bias. That is, associations that people make between races and good and bad terms and concepts that even among people who are not overtly racist. But even that, whether you want to call it implicit bias, that's been in decline over the decades in which she has done the studies. So by many, many measures, there has been progress. Progress does not mean perfection, but it does mean that we have to recognize the good that has been achieved, figure out what's gone right and do more of it.
And yet the response to your book, Steve, some of the bilious, contemptuous responses, and not just on Twitter, but actual intelligent engagement, really do show that there's a meme out there that really resists what is obviously perfect common sense. And so let's just imagine the world of the United States in the middle of the 18th century. We've all probably seen that photograph of Emily Dickinson. Now take that and make it in color and make it a wide-angle lens and imagine the world she lived in terms of disease, in terms of sexism, classism, racism, in terms of what food people had to eat, how music sounded, everything. It's perfectly clear that the life that we lead now, despite who the president is, despite global warming, despite the impending large epidemics we might suffer, despite all that, clearly there's been a great amount of progress. Nobody could possibly deny it. Instead, the idea is that to be an enlightened person, to be maybe a blessed person, is to pretend that isn't true and to play the Cassandra because you absolutely have to show that you're aware, for example, of discrimination, that you're aware, for example, of suffering among people who don't live in fortunate countries like this. Of course you want to be aware of those things, but when it gets to the point that you read The Better Angels of Our Nature or Enlightenment Now, and absolutely despise it as if it was Mein Kampf, and call Steven Pinker a charlatan and a quack and shallow, that's religion. Because if it isn't religion, then it doesn't make sense. The way to make sense of that kind of human evaluation from people who often have PhDs is that they are processing things through a different kind of frame. And it's a frame that's very familiar to us. It's a religious frame where you suspend disbelief because you wish to demonstrate your faith. That's what this is. It scares me, frankly.
So I'm going to give you a hypothetical that I think maybe puts more pressure on this in some way. So right now, there's 30,000 deaths on highways in just America every year. About 30,000 people die on the cars. If I could press some magic button right here and reduce that number to just 5,000, that sounds like a good bargain. But I'm going to tell you the way it would work. Right now, there's 30,000. Just tonight, probably there was 7. I haven't done the math that happened, and we won't hear about it. Some random blips on some graph somewhere. So the 5,000 button that I'm going to press, it's going to work like this. Next year, 2019, there'll be 5 random days where 1,000 people will die in one awful big accident. Some terrible, huge pileup that 1,000 people die. We'll see it on the news. There'll be helicopters, whatever it is. But only 5 days, 360 days, every car arrives and safely, perfectly, and everyone's happy. The Pinker graphs, which is what I've been calling them with my friends these days, coining a term. The Pinker graphs looks great. It's going in the right direction. It's a huge drop. But would you press that button? Does that world? And how do you convince people that that button is actually the moral button to press? Where, I don't know, I feel like people are thinking that's the world we actually live in, and pressing that button, and maybe saying we shouldn't have pressed it.
Yeah, so there are a number of very interesting shapers of our sense of the world and the dangers that there are. A number of them identified by Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman and Paul Slovic, the availability heuristic, that we use our own brain's search engine as a kind of quick and dirty way of doing statistics. The quicker something occurs to us, the higher it is on the results of the search list, the more probable we judge it to be. Yeah. And so the pileups, like the terrorist attacks, like the rampage killings, determine our assessment of how much violence there is, whereas all of the routine police blotter homicides that kind of creep in at about 40 a day, but few of which make the news, don't affect our assessment. So your 5,000 body pileup would undoubtedly make the news. A far greater number of fatalities dribbling in a few a day do not. So that is one distorter. There's another one that has not been studied, as far as I know, in the cognitive psychology literature, which is that intentional harm is judged as worse and more upsetting than accidental harm. And that's one of the reasons, together with the availability heuristic, that terrorism and rampage shootings have an outsized claim on our attention. Terrorist deaths in particular are a tiny fraction of deaths from auto accidents, from ordinary homicides, from even fairly minor sources of mortality, like getting struck by lightning, drowning in a bathtub, dying of an allergic reaction from a bee sting. All these kill more people every year than terrorists. So why do we go to war, invade countries, have a Department of Homeland Security, have metal scanners and obsessive ID checks against this, what's statistically speaking, a relatively minor threat? Mm-hmm. Part of it is that the deaths from bee stings don't make headlines and terrorist deaths do. The other is there is something a little different about harm caused by an intelligent, malevolent agent that's out there, that even if the number of deaths isn't the same, have a greater claim on our mental bandwidth. Probably for the reason that there's no thought that you can have, no emotional reaction you have will affect the next bolt of lightning. Lightning doesn't care what you think, whereas terrorists, at least potentially, can care what you think in terms of the countermeasures. And so we're constantly obsessed with countermeasures, even if pure engineering could save far more lives. Yeah.
So do you press that button? And if you press it,
you mean 5,000 versus 30,000?
5 random days, 1,000 people each day. And how would you design that world? Yeah, how you press that button?
Oh, sure, press the button.
And what would, I mean, who's then to blame here? It sounds like you're pointing the finger at the media in some ways. Imagine if all of our phones went off every time there was a single person who died in an auto accident, and right now everybody's phone was bleeping every 20 minutes. Then the availability of that, it would be we would want that to end immediately. So you press it, but what would be your recommendation to make people feel like that was the better world?
Yeah, I think that the journalism and intellectual life should be more data-driven and less incident-driven. We should have, in particular, not just because of what are now well-identified bugs in our cognitive psychology, but because the habit of giving lavish coverage to the malevolent harm doers creates the perverse incentive that the media have provided a way that anyone can become famous overnight. Namely, if the most important thing in your life is to become famous, and it's more important even than life itself, we now have given them the opportunity, kill some innocent people, the more the better, and you'll become a celebrity. You may not live to see it, but you can enjoy the anticipation. So to forestall both of those risks, I think journalism should be much more like or at least should include sort of dashboards, like graphs that are updated as the data come in the same way as we have sports scores, and weather, and the stock market, things that are reported day in, day out, not just on the extreme days, so we know what's happening with the homicide rate, the auto accident rate, the suicide rate, CO2 emissions. It shouldn't just be in outlier years that we know what's going on.
It strikes me there might be a race analogy, to bring it back to something you maybe didn't want to go to, with the cop killings. It seems those ones are the ones that get the attention and thus shape our... it seems like that button has already been pressed. We're ignoring the 30,000 and we're only seeing the 5,000.
Yeah, the media naturally are interested in those incidents. They are terrible incidents. One always thinks of the families of the people, and not to mention the people that it happens to. But it certainly isn't the story of being black in America the way we're often told. And, I have two careers. I do my happy language stuff, and there's the he's controversial race stuff. And they're, for me, two different people with very small intersections. But the race stuff comes from the fact that I grew up thinking, yes, racism exists, yes, I experience it, but I don't understand why. I've been taught that to be an educated, enlightened black person, this is something I started feeling when I was a teenager, is to pretend that things are much worse than they actually are. To pretend that some passing slight is destroying me psychologically, to pretend that being black in America now isn't much better, even for the poor, than it was 50 years ago. I just thought, why am I being told to pretend? I didn't wonder whether I was wrong, frankly, because once again, the facts are so clear. I found myself thinking, why is it that all of these brilliant people are pretending? And it couldn't be that they're crazy. To look at behavior and thought like that and think these people are crazy is lazy, sloppy thinking. They're not crazy, they're not insane, they're not malevolent, but what's going on here? And I thought to myself, okay, there's a religion, and the white side of the religion is that you're supposed to show that you're not a racist, and that's more important than engaging with facts. And then with many black people, I think that we're taught that our jobs are to fashion an identity built around thinking of ourselves as survivors of daily onslaughts of racism. And if you're asked to say what the onslaught is, there are things that you can mention, and everybody listens to you and thinks, was that really that bad? But Lord forbid you say it, because you'll be macheted, and so people gradually learn not to say that. But really, my life is much better than my grandfather's. My life is better than my father's, infinitely so. And the amount of racism that I experience is frankly less than that many people with other handicaps, genuine handicaps, experience. It just isn't enough to matter. Structural racism is real, and you can battle it, but it's nothing like it was in 1931, and that can't be contested. And so the issue is why we talk about these things in these ways. And I think that religion needs to be fought, because people can get to the point that they're so busy being religious that they're not helping poor people become less poor. And that really worries me. And so I've written some books that, it's interesting, when they come out, they're often treated as something to be shot after like vermin. There are people who professionally despise them because, suddenly I am Galileo. And then as time goes by, people start coming out of the corners and saying, no, not that I was brilliant, but that I wasn't crazy, because I never was crazy. That's what happens with these books. And that's what happens with the commentary. And so I just consider it my duty, because for some reason, I'm not sure what the reason is, it isn't only arrogance, I simply cannot pretend. I've never been able to pretend. Maybe I don't need group membership enough to follow that siren song, but somebody needs to say, you don't have to think this way. And I remember back in the year 2000 thinking, somebody needs to put this on paper the way Shelby Steele did when he basically informed me of these things. And there are people here tonight who seem to have read some of my stuff and are keeping going. That's the idea, to let people know that you can say these things and the sky won't fall, and it doesn't mean that you aren't stupid, and it doesn't mean that you aren't moral, and it doesn't mean that you aren't authentically black. It means that you're trying to make some goddamn sense. That is what my race work has been about. But that's not fun. The fun is the language stuff, the happy language stuff.
So I want to throw it to you guys now with the Q&A section. You can ask John the happy stuff or the angry stuff. It's totally up to you.
Mostly happy.
Mostly happy. We have a mic, and yes, give them a round of applause. There's a microphone, and Nathan's going to bring it to whoever.
Check. No.
There's a button that turns green. Yeah. Maybe you muted it. I don't know.
Fake news.
I don't know. No, it's red. Check. There we go.
All right, thanks.
Let's start with one. Mr. Coleman Hughes is here, as also is amazing. Don't clap for him.
This is a question that has to do with both language and progress. Professor Pinker, you've talked in the past about the euphemism treadmill, which is the idea that when there's a stigmatized group in society, the label that we use to describe them often changes every 10 or 20 years until the stigma itself is removed, at which point a label can kind of stick. I've noticed that, so for example, black people used to be called colored, and then Negro, and then African American. Seems like African American, though you've said it tonight, is kind of out of fashion among people my age. People just say black now.
That's what I'm hearing from people who say.
Yeah. So part one is, do you think that's indicative of the stigma lifting? What do you make of that in the context of the euphemism treadmill hypothesis? Second part of the question is, what do you, for these both questions for both of you, what do you think of the word Latinx? I see this word now in the New York Times. It's a gender-neutral descriptor of what used to be called Latino people. So, like, I'm sure that my Spanish-speaking family members would not really recognize this term. I'm sure the average Guatemalan crossing the border would not recognize this term. Especially ironic because Spanish is a language that's particularly masculinized and feminized. Every noun is. So it seems like some of these, the cycling through of names, some of them are top down, some of them are bottom up. What do you think of that word?
Latinx? Like X?
Yes.
I've just learned something. And I read the New York Times. I've not seen Latinx. So you don't have to say Latino or Latina?
Yeah,
Was Latino considered feminine, or it's new?
Well, Latino is male and Latina, so the idea is to not have to indicate the gender every time you use such words. And it started in writing, and then people started pronouncing it. And I always thought, I mean, to tell you the truth, Coleman, I avoid pronouncing about these things where I feel like I'm out of my yard. And it really depends on how Latinos feel about it. Of course, this starts with a certain small cluster of intellectual Latinos. Is it going to spread to the rest of the population? Probably not. But as far as I'm concerned, I'm all for keeping our minds off of gender to the extent that we can. Latinx feels clumsy because it uses the letter X. It doesn't sound good. Nevertheless, I'm not sure what other solution I would have come up with. I would guess that it's only going to go so far because, as you said, your relatives wouldn't recognize it. I live in a neighborhood where every single person speaks Spanish all day long except me. I have never heard anybody saying it on the streets. But I respect the attempt.
Yeah, and echoing something that John and I are both aware of, and that John has written about a lot, it almost doesn't matter what we think, because the language is going to kind of do its thing no matter what, and we're just going to be steamrollered over it, whatever our opinions are, in a process that's very hard to predict. So it would not, we have not had a gender-neutral pronoun that has caught on, like ko or na, and maybe it will.
Or heesh.
Or heesh, or sh, slash he, she. It could happen, and our opinions are good to know. It's just like whether a particular cat video goes viral or not. In terms of the, I've lived through several of these linguistic shifts when it comes to referring to blacks or African Americans, because when I was a child, we had this word Negro, which sounds vaguely racist now, but of course Martin Luther King often referred to Negro rights as the United Negro College Fund. I lived through the Negro to black transition. And every time one of these transitions takes place, there's always a theory as to why, to what's behind it. So I remember that if you're referring to white people as white, you needed the symmetrical term for African Americans. So if it's good, white Negro is not a parallel contrast. If one kind of people are white, the other should be black. Now that was completely forgotten in the 90s when Jesse Jackson and others advocated African American. What they should have done is said, if you have African Americans, then the so-called white people should be called Euro-Americans or European Americans, and there'd be a certain logic to that. In fact, much more accurate than black and white. But the thing is that the rationales are always post hoc, after the fact. What really drives it is probably the sense that there's something a little bit uncomfortable about the current term, and we do want to somehow refresh it, to rebrand it, and that opens up the market for the new term, whatever it is. I also lived through the demise of the term Oriental, which used to be perfectly neutral. Now again, it sounds vaguely
That
racist.
happened within like 2 weeks. Boom. Yeah.
That's so true.
Yeah.
Although that's stuck, as far as I know. Although I shouldn't pronounce on that. Being, it tends to be young people that drive these changes. Would you agree with that?
Definitely, usually. Yeah,
usually.
Another one. Take one in the back. Whoever you like. I wouldn't. Yeah. There you go.
Hey guys, thank you for coming out tonight. Did either of you see the Fox article today about studying whale sounds? And then if we were potentially able to pick up alien language, we could use what we learned from whale sounds or other animals on Earth to understand their language. It was really interesting.
Can you impersonate a whale for us? We'll try it up here. To do a whale.
All right.
Yeah.
It's such a neat idea. They're enormous, they're social, they appear to mourn their dead. You want the whales to be talking. You want that. It's just like, it's happening with elephants lately too. But the question is, do they have shared attention? And yeah, they probably have that. Remember this list? Do they have labels? So, when they're doing all this, does all of that correspond to labeling actions, things, and qualities? Or is it a matter of a certain small set of primal commands having to do with eating, sex, defense, and maybe even being sad that one whale no longer exists? Do they have syntax? Are they saying not only fight, but we're going to fight over there, or I want you to come here, you come here? Is there displacement? Now maybe, because they go in a lot of places. Can they go and they're referring to something other than the that they're doing right then and being watched do by all the other whales? The chances are infinitesimal that those marvelous creatures are using language in the way that I'm using it right now and talking to you, but boy, I would love it if it turned out that they were. That is my answer to that question.
When our whales go to Mars, we'll know. It's, where's the mic?
It's over here.
Okay, who's close? Pamela.
Thank you. So first of all, thank you. This is fabulous, and Jay, great job. This is just fantastic. Yeah. So I'm really interested in this conversation about Lara Boroditsky's work, and in particular, the very nuanced idea about the, time and the colors and the different language and the male and female things and all of that. So, in what way might That
Is that a whale?
It's displacement. In what way could the understanding of, for example, the fact that one language uses a long time and the other uses a lot of time, and how that shapes cognition, even if it's in just a tiny way, what insight does that give us about how the ways that we use words can change our cognition, in particular with respect to the ways in which we do change the way we talk about things, even in our own language? So whether it's the stigma associated with something, or it's locker room talk, or the things that culturally maybe are related and shape how we think.
The reason I distinguished the strong hypothesis of linguistic determinism, according to which we actually think in our native language, from the weaker version that our language can affect our thoughts, is that the weaker version encompasses so many diverse ideas, some of which are just fall into the general phenomenon that everything that we experience can affect the way we think in terms of our thoughts, our attitudes. And so the words that are around us, of course they can affect what we think, just as the way people, what people say, the way they dress, the way they act. That's the whole thing about thought. We can think about anything. And among the things that we think about are the way people express themselves. And so there are many ways, such as choice of words that differ in connotation, the difference between calling someone thin, scrawny, slender, fat versus full-figured versus zaftig. We've long known that the word hoard of a language has synonyms that differ in their emotional effects. That's a way in which language affects thought. The whole art of writing, rhetoric, self-expression depends on the fact that the words we choose affect the message that we convey, including the emotional layering. There's a whole other set of effects where we use snatches of sound, or actually more accurately, we use a pantomime of articulation as a working memory storage medium. One of the ways to offload the computational demands on pure thought is if we say something to ourselves, that whole system of controlling the lips and the tongue and forming an auditory image is a way to maintain information in memory over the short term in a way that frees up the more central rational thinking parts to do their thing while these items are reverberating in this auditory memory. So a powerful way in which language can affect thought is that if your language gives you a word for something, then you can offload your thinking by using that auditory image to hold something in mind temporarily. And there are probably other ways, but there are all ways in which thought as a capability that we have can be augmented or shifted by choice of words, which is different than the idea that we actually think in English as our medium of cognition.
The one in the back there.
Thanks to everybody here. This is a great night. First, I'm guessing English has the most words of any language, and then does complexity of language then lend itself to complexity of thinking? In other words, if you're able to give someone a languageless IQ test, the people who grow up in cultures with complex languages do better on those kinds of tests because their thought is more complex because of the language.
No, I see what you mean. On English and having the most words, that's a really tough one because first, what's a word? And so is IBM a word? Is have, has, and had one word or three? You could go on and on. Languages that are written, which is really only about 200 of the 7,000, often have what's called large vocabularies because you can write down the words and collect them in a book called a dictionary. And so in a dictionary, there'll be a word like tergiversation. Or there'll be a word like ruth, like ruthless. There is a word ruth and it means mercy. Is that a word? No. It's just that it was written down and so we can pretend that it still is. So, English, Russian, Spanish, you can say, oh, they have mighty vocabularies. But it's because they're written. Whereas if you're dealing with an oral language, which is almost every language, you can only have as many words as the community can remember. And that is several tens of thousands of words. But in terms of the complexity, and linguists will say you have to be very careful in deciding what complexity is, but after a couple glasses of wine, linguists who do field work will also say some languages are a lot harder than others. English is not among the hardest. But if you take the languages that really do have the most sounds, the most ridiculous rules, the longest words, I can guarantee you that the speakers of those languages would be much less likely to do well on an IQ test than anybody in here. And English is a pretty stripped down little bastard of a language. So for example, the most complex language I know of is one called Ket. It's spoken by negative 17 people in a very swampy area in Siberia. It's so complicated that grammarians still haven't quite figured out how the verbs work after 100 years. And no, we'd all do better on an IQ test, despite the fact that that language seems to account for every little jot and tittle of existence just because nobody's ever stopped it from doing it. So I take your point, but no, I'm sorry.
The other aspect to that is that a language, there's a difference between a language conceptualized as all the words that have ever existed assembled into a dictionary versus what any mortal human actually knows. But also, because language itself is not was never handed down to us from some committee on high. It's something that we're constantly expanding as we need. It's a wiki. Everyone contributes. And when the reason that I don't think that, say, even the paucity of a technical vocabulary would determine a limitation of thought on its speakers is that when you need concepts, you coin them, you borrow them, you use neologisms, you use jargon, and so the vocabulary that people use can very quickly expand when they need it. My favorite example is the revival of modern Hebrew, starting about I guess 120, 130 years ago, when as part of the Zionist project, the Yeshuv in Palestine, a fanatical lexicographer, Eliezer Ben Yehuda, just had the idea.
He was insane.
He was insane. He was insane. Yeah, we agree. We had the idea that Yiddish was the language of the ghetto, and if we're starting a new Jewish state in the Middle East, we can't have people import ghetto culture. We're going back to our biblical roots, and so we should all speak Hebrew, a language that had not been spoken for something like 2,000 years. I guess there was Aramaic, it was used as a liturgical language, but he had this crazy idea of reviving what was biblical Hebrew. Now, of course, as John and I would both attest, that's impossible. And in fact, modern Hebrew is not, some linguists argue it shouldn't even be called Hebrew, it should be called Israeli. But nonetheless, he had the idea, and ab initio, there were no words for things like bacteria or microscope or tractor. This did not hold Israel back. They just massively expanded vocabulary, partly because the resources of the Hebrew language that he preserved had ability to generate new words from old roots. They massively borrowed from English and from Arabic and from Yiddish and Polish and so on, and so the language expanded to fill the need.
Thank you. I wanted to ask about Enlightenment Now as a political project. So I was wondering, when there are populist upheavals all over the Western world, when more people in so many countries are saying that their country is on the wrong track, kind of what use is it to club them over the head with charts saying that you're actually wrong about your own subjective experience of your own country, because these charts show that your life is better, your country is actually improving. What is the strategy there for that as a political project?
Well, I'm not a political strategist or a messenger or a spreader of news. I don't claim to have a technique of turning around entire populations. I do make arguments for people who care about arguments, and these include the politicians, the political staff, the journalists, the intellectuals, the people in media, because a lot of our worldview has to come from the media, simply because we don't, any of us, encounter people by the millions to know the state of the country through direct experience. What I can say is that it is not true that people are unaffected by data when it's presented to them. Generally, the facts that I try to present in Enlightenment Now are unknown. People have a systematically incorrect understanding of the direction of the world, often of their own country. People think that crime is increasing when it's decreasing. People think that poverty is increasing globally, whereas it's decreasing by a lot, and so on. And the reason that that's particularly important is that it's a fallacy to think that the populist unrest comes from people being miserable about their own lives. There's a massive phenomenon in polling, sometimes called the Optimism Gap, that if you ask people about their own lives, they are not particularly pessimistic. In fact, they may even be irrationally optimistic. There is the whole psychological phenomenon of positive illusions.
That's what's normal, right? This is how people normally behave.
That's how people normally believe. People think that they're sometimes called the Lake Woebegone effect. Everyone is above average. People think they're less likely than the typical person to be the victim of divorce, unemployment, cancer, accident, something that cannot possibly be true by definition. But we are all overly optimistic about our own lives, but when you shift the question from your own life to your country, then, as I put it, people shift from Pollyanna to Eeyore. They think that, yeah, my kids' schools are pretty good, but the schools of the country are failing. Kids aren't learning a thing. My own neighborhood, yeah, it's pretty safe, but every other neighborhood, it's a jungle, it's a death trap. My own economic prospects the next 10 years, I think I'll get better, but everyone else is barely treading water. So a lot of the anger, the discontent is not from people assessing their own lives, it's from their own understanding of which way their country is going. And that is very much affected by the conventional wisdom from journalism, from media, and that is something that I hope to nudge, just with a more accurate picture of the world.
Can I throw something in about Enlightenment Now, just for the sake of clarity? The book has wonderful charts, but I think there's a meme about that book that it's the book of Steve's charts. And Jay, I completely understand what you're talking about. Beautiful charts. But when I read that book, it was on a park bench. I was sitting there. I wasn't really thinking about the charts. I just want to get in that book is full of very elegant argumentation. Like the pictures are nice, but you're actually making points with the prose as well. But it's harder to throw that at people.
No, and I'm glad you mentioned it, because I do have all of those graphs in the middle part of the book to document the claim that the ideals of the Enlightenment, reason, science, and humanism, we've tried them out for 250 years. How well have they been doing? And the answer I argue is not so bad. But the heart of the book is to argue for those ideals. Part of the argument is by their fruits ye shall judge them, or how does the proof of the pudding is in the eating, and so on. Part of it is an argument that we, and this does speak to the political project, that if you're not a populist, if you're not a reactionary seeking to move society backwards, if you're not a religious fundamentalist, if you're not a Marxist, what are you? And what I suggest is that there is a positive agenda, which I roughly identify with the ideals of the Enlightenment, namely that if we use reason and science and knowledge with the goal of enhancing human welfare, then we can gradually succeed. So a lot of the book is an argument for that idea.
I spending a lot of time on this question because I think it's really important, but I wanted to give a pitch for Hans Rosling, who's someone I know is a hero to a lot of us up here. If you don't know the site Gapminder, GAPMINDER.org, I think, not .com. I think his charts are actually more beautiful than yours, no offense.
Far more, unquestionably, far more beautiful.
They're unbelievable,
yeah.
and as a filmmaker, I'm always thinking visually, and I was going to ask you about how do I make your data more emotional? Is that the goal, to hijack people's emotions because it's already there, to point it in the direction that this gentleman's asking about? I think Hans did it incredibly well, and it was really simple. If you load gapminder.org, I don't know how well it works on a phone, but the first one that comes up is life expectancy, I think is on the Y, and child mortality or GDP per capita is on the X. And
is this with the balloons?
Well, it's bubbles.
Bubbles.
Yeah, the bigger ones are the population. It's just a really elegant chart, but what he added was a slider at the bottom of time, which is something you can't do on a book, on a flat page.
Or you can animate it. You can let time.
You can animate it, so you need to watch it on a digital thing. But he made these amazing charts where if you just look at the thing, oh, you think Africa's over here and America and Singapore is up here. Whoa, this is a really unequal world. But you get this slider and you get to see a little bit of the trend. It may be a way, I don't know if this answers your question, but to make it a political project, there's a way to make the graphs and the data more meaningful or more emotional, because again, that's already there, and we see people reacting emotionally. It's a pitch for Hans Rosling, and he died a couple of years ago.
He died a couple of years ago. His son Ola and his daughter-in-law are carrying it on, and I think Ola deserves some of the credit for developing that software.
Yes.
What's amazing is just, not only is it just visually compelling, because we are primates, a third of our brain is devoted to vision. It's the way that we grasp quantitative relations, but it was a way of getting 5-dimensional data onto a 2-dimensional screen, where motion, color, and size were utilized to convey 3 additional quantitative variables.
Yeah, you could play with the axes and throw like the number of roads that are paved in a country. The data is not always perfect, but it's amazing to see it change throughout time. Anyway, it was a really good question. We spent time on it. Let's get another one.
John, just a question. From some of the interviews I've seen previously, you talked about during the 1990s, you took a little bit of flack for speaking out against using Ebonics in public education systems. At the beginning of this program, you stated how they were equally beautiful languages, intricate, Martians wouldn't be able to distinguish. If they truly do have those same intricacies and beauty to them, and they relate better to certain individuals, why would you not want to encourage that for those students that they might relate to it better? And do you see any connection between that and, I forget his name, the insane person, between Hebrew and Yiddish, if it's constantly evolving?
Oh, that's a really neat question. The idea was, back in the late 90s, that there was a proposal, which had been made in some other places, but Fox News was new and it was a slow news cycle, and so it became a national issue, which was that the Oakland School Board wanted to use Black English as a transition for especially poorer Black kids from not reading to reading. The idea was that maybe they had such trouble, these kids learning how to read, because standard English is different enough from their home dialect that it's confusing for them to see isn't rather than ain't on the page, etc. So the idea was to treat them as bilinguals, in a sense, and start the kids with Black English and then transition them to standard English. You can imagine how the media utterly distorted that, and the idea was people teaching jive in the classroom, etc. But my first taste of media, which I did not expect. Many people often say I've carved out a niche as, no, I was doing my academic work and found a camera looking at me because I just said no. The reason that these kids aren't doing well is because of their home lives and the schools are bad. It's not because they have trouble seeing isn't on the page, which every second person in their community uses all the time, and they're so used to ain't. I just found the argument incoherent, and basically what it comes down to is this. This was another one of these cases where you might disagree with me, but I don't think I was crazy, and I tried to make my point very carefully, and a lot of people back then would refuse to speak to me at conferences. There are people to this day who clearly are kind of giving me the stink eye because of things that I said on TV in 1997, and various, again, kind, brilliant people despised me for saying that kids in poor Black schools are not being denied translation exercises. That was the religion. I wouldn't have put it that way then. But the idea was that this issue must be based on some kind of racism. These kids aren't being treated as bilinguals the way, say, kids from Bosnia would be. And that's one more example of how black people have it hard. Whereas I was saying, what you do, and I was talking about educational techniques that work, etc., there is somebody named Siegfried Engelmann who developed, way back in the 1960s, a perfect method for teaching people from bookless homes how to read. It's been tested on poor white kids, on poor black kids, in places, 9 different places in the country at the time, now almost 100 different places. We know how to do it. There are books where you can teach anybody how to read. I've used that method to teach my daughter, when she was 3, how to read. It works. Everybody knows this in the field of people who talk about black English and talk about how it works, because there's a certain intersection between Engelmann and one of his comrades' work and people who started studying black English in the 60s and 70s. Suddenly in 1997, nobody had ever heard of it. And so, if I said, well, we know how to teach a poor black kid how to read, you use a special phonics method that's been demonstrated beyond any shadow of a doubt to work, I would say that, and no, I just wasn't a good black person. That was a perfect example. And to this day, there are well-intentioned, brilliant people who are still proposing that you use dialect readers for poor black kids, despite the fact that the evidence that this works is very thin, when the evidence that using Engelmann's direct instruction method is absolutely watertight. And yet to this day, I will say to some of the relevant people, what about Engelmann? And I'm looked at as if I said something about the 5th dimension. It's because of the religion. Thank you for asking that question.
I'm going to add something that there's no contradiction between saying that, let's say, Black English and Standard English are equally complex, but saying that kids should really learn how to read and write Standard English, not only because of the sheer pedagogical efficacy of different methods of literacy training, but because there is an advantage to something being standard just because it's standard, not because it's better, but because there's a huge advantage in speaking the same language, however good, however bad, not a question of whether it's inferior or superior. The fact that everyone else uses it is itself a reason to master it, just so you're on the same wavelength as everyone else. This is a distinction that's critical in understanding language, because it also pops up in a different context that I've encountered. Namely, what is correct or incorrect grammar in writing Standard English. I wrote a style manual where I had to deal with this in noting that there is nothing particularly illogical about particular constructions that are deemed incorrect. Nonetheless, or dictionary definitions that are not standard. That doesn't mean you should be unaware of them as a careful writer. Doesn't mean that you should flout them. Even if there's nothing inherently wrong with them, the mere fact that they just aren't part of the standard language as it is has evolved in a community is reason itself to adopt it, no matter how good or bad it is. If it is the standard, that's the way you want to write. And the standard, of course, will change. It will evolve. It's a moving target. But whatever it is at a given moment, there's a huge advantage to mastering it.
Where's our microphone? Okay.
In terms of etiquette, I wanted to ask, is there a right and wrong way in saying the word? So, is my way correct? Or is the other person's way correct? My question is, what's the correct etiquette? If you encounter someone that you think is saying the word incorrectly, do you correct them? Is it proper etiquette to correct them? Like, how do you go about this?
No. I mean, I don't mean to be flippant, but if somebody pronounces a word in a way that very few other people use it, that's what incorrect would be. Because if the person is saying clarinet instead of clarinet, to me it's clarinet, but there are people, especially from parts of the South, who say clarinet. Well, it's not wrong. It's the way people say it in Texas. But suppose my own mother, for example, I've never said this in public, but time is going by and she is no longer with us. For reasons I don't know. It wasn't because she was black or Southern. My mother said grocery. I don't know. And she didn't have any kind of speech defect, but for some reason on the word grocery, she said grocery. I don't know why. And so I grew up saying grocery myself until I was about 8. And gradually I realized the only person who says this is my mother. And my mother was a very crisply spoken, articulate person, but there was this grow-free thing. And so that was wrong. I'm sure she had said grow-free all her life, and many people had heard her. What would the purpose have been of telling her to stop saying grow-free? Because, she had a PhD, she was a well-regarded person, she just had this one little eccentricity. So let's say that somebody says herbs instead of herbs, depending on what side of the pond they're on. Why does it matter? I'm not accusing you of anything, but I think that there's a little bit of all of us, and it's in me to an extent too, that feels that we're supposed to call people like that out because, don't you think it's because it makes us feel good? What purpose does it serve? Unless that person is going to make a fool of themselves in public. But my mother rarely talked about grow-frees in public. So it just didn't matter.
There's some of the etiquette of when you tell someone that their fly is down and they got spinach between their teeth. So you kind of do it with the same kind of social graces that you would for anything else, where if they would be mortified if it hadn't been pointed out to them, then it is an act of mercy to point it out discreetly and privately. And I'll just end with one anecdote. I had a graduate student. I won't name him. He's actually become pretty well known. But we wrote a paper together, and he was going to give a talk based on our work to the department. I could not be there on the day that he gave that talk. I was going to be out of town, so he was going to give it himself as a grad student. He rehearsed the talk to me. And part of it, just as an example, I had to refer to a kind of an extinct woolly elephant that he called a mastodon. I let it pass. I was commenting on the style. I didn't want to embarrass him. And then a week passed. I went to San Diego. He gave a talk. I said, "Well, how'd it go? How'd it go?" He said, "Well, it went great, except when I used the word mastodon, everyone started to laugh at me." I really should have told him that it's not mastodon. It's mastodon.
It depends.
So with that, I want to thank these guys and everyone. They're going to hang around a little bit, but like I said, they've had a long day, and they've been gracious enough to do this for us. This was free, so if you didn't like it, you could ask for your money back. Other than that, thank you very much. And
thank you, folks.